Listen carefully. Because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to survive the whispers that carried it. There are stories buried so deep in American soil that the roots of history have grown around them like a fist. And if you pull too hard, the ground bleeds. This is one of those stories. It begins not with love, not with war, but with a transaction. A kind of human ledger entry so cold, so calculated, that even time itself tried to bury the evidence. Yet here you are, about to hear it, and once you do, you won't walk away the same. In the late summer heat of 1847, when the air in Virginia felt thick enough to drown in, Colonel Edmund Hartley made a decision that would cost him his legacy, his bloodline, and eventually his life. He didn't just break the moral code of his age. He rewrote it. The colonel wasn't the kind of man who waited for fate to answer his problems. He engineered outcomes, and when society refused to give him what he wanted, a grandchild, a future, and hair, he built his own solution out of flesh, paperwork, force, and silence. His daughter, Margaret, 32 years old, unmarried, withdrawing into the quiet decay of a life stalled. His strongest slave, Joseph, 6'3", educated in secret, a body forged by labor, a mind sharpened in darkness. The colonel looked at them not as people, but as components, two variables to be locked in a cabin until nature, or desperation, produced the result he needed. No court recorded the deal, no preacher blessed it, no law acknowledged it. The colonel didn't need any of those things. Power was the only permission slip he believed in. For 183 days, two lives were sealed together under forced isolation. One would emerge swollen with life, the other would not emerge at all. But here's the part the historians never printed. The colonel thought he was in control. He believed the cabin was a chamber designed for creation. He never imagined it would become a chamber designed for correction. A silent factory of consequences that would outlive him, stain his name, and rewrite the truth of who really held power on that plantation. And now that you've heard the first crack in the facade, don't look away. The descent has already begun. The wagon wheels that carried Margaret and Joseph down that narrow path didn't just roll over dirt. They crossed a threshold. From the moment the cabin door shut, the world they knew ceased to exist. What remained was a structure built of wood, hunger, silence, and command. No witnesses, no neighbors, no church bells. Just two human beings reduced to functions inside a plan they did not design. Margaret entered that cabin believing she was the imprisoned one. Joseph entered it knowing he was the expendable one. She had been raised to obey. He had been trained to survive. Neither understood yet that the colonel had made a fatal miscalculation. He locked two conscious minds inside a space he thought was made of walls. But it was made of pressure. And pressure doesn't just bend people, it reveals the metal at their core. The first week was quiet, too quiet. Margaret spoke in fragments, still clinging to the etiquette of a world that had already abandoned her. Joseph answered in yes, ma'ams, and no, ma'ams, the practiced rhythm of a man who understood how to make himself invisible in the presence of power. But the silence between them wasn't peaceful, it was loaded. Like two pistols laid on a table, waiting for someone to reach first. What the colonel never calculated was the third force inside that cabin: time. Time stretches, warps, interrogates. With no society to perform for, no eyes to judge them, the mask each had worn for years began to crack. Margaret wasn't just a daughter. Joseph wasn't just property. And every hour they sat breathing the same air. The more dangerous that truth became. She studied Joseph when he wasn't looking. Not the body her father wanted from him, but the posture of a man who was always measuring exits. Joseph observed her too. Not as the planter's daughter, but as someone carrying a different kind of captivity. One harder to escape, a lifetime of obedience disguised as respect. Soon their silence became language. Language became awareness. Awareness became a threat. The colonel thought he had sealed them into a breeding cage. What he actually built was a chamber of awakening. 2 minds. 1 closed system, no escape. Because once 2 prisoners realize they are not enemies, the walls don't just confine them anymore, they target the one who built them. By the 2nd month, the cabin had stopped feeling like a place and started feeling like a clock. Each day a new tick toward an outcome. No one dared to name out loud. The Cunnel expected nature to take its course. But nature doesn't work on command. Not even under threat. Not even under law. And when nature refuses, the human mind starts to mutate. Margaret was the first to shift. The obedience drilled into her since childhood began to splinter under the weight of isolation. There were no mirrors in the cabin, yet she could feel her reflection dissolving. No more corsets. No more collars. No more silent dining room rules. The woman her father wanted her to be was dying. But something else, something sharper, was being born in her place. Joseph noticed it. Not in her words, but in how she stopped asking permission to speak. She would eat without waiting for him to sit. She would read aloud to the room without addressing him first. She stopped shrinking herself. And the more she stopped shrinking, the more the lies of her upbringing began to rot inside her. One night, she asked the question no white woman of her station was ever supposed to ask a man like Joseph. "What do you think of my father?" What Joseph didn't answer. Not because he didn't have one, but because he had too many. Answers that could kill him. Answers that could save her. Answers that carried the weight of every back broken under the illusion of Southern honor. Instead, he said, "I think your father believes he's God, and God doesn't negotiate." That was the first time she laughed in the cabin. Not because it was funny, but because it was true. That same night, she noticed something else. Joseph didn't eat the cornbread. He pushed it aside. Not rudely, deliberately. Like a man who knew more than he was allowed to say. Later, when she was alone, she found something in the medical book her father had left behind, a paragraph about arsenic. Not as a poison used by murderers, but as a slow, undetectable killer passed through food, dust, or even air. She read that passage 3 times. Then she looked at the wallpaper, the peeling green wallpaper, and for the first time, she didn't feel trapped. She felt armed. Arsenic. The word didn't frighten her. It focused her. Margaret had lived her entire life under the illusion that danger came from outside. War, scandal, poverty. But here in the cabin, danger had a new shape knowledge. And once she held it, the balance inside those walls shifted forever. She didn't tell Joseph what she'd discovered. Not yet. She needed to know whether he already knew. Whether he had seen it too. Whether they were silently playing the same game, or moving toward different exits. So she watched him, not openly. She had learned subtlety from a lifetime of polite oppression. She noticed how he handled the food, how he wiped plates before eating, how he avoided leaning against the walls, how he slept with the window cracked even in cold air. He knew that meant something far bigger than poison was happening between them. They were no longer strangers forced together. They were now co-conspirators in a truth neither could speak. And that kind of unspoken alliance is more dangerous to a tyrant than any weapon. Meanwhile, the Cunnel's visits grew colder. He arrived with questions disguised as inspections, and orders disguised as concern. Margaret could see it now, how he never looked directly at Joseph, only at the body he wanted to use. How he addressed her like a vessel, not a daughter. His authority wasn't paternal. It was mechanical. A man who believed bloodline could be engineered the way one breeds cattle. But the Cunnel wasn't the only hunter. Time was stalking him too. Margaret began keeping a mental ledger, not of dates, but of tells. Her father's pacing, his increased drinking, the way his voice shook when he referenced, or future. The way his eyes kept darting to the door when he spoke, as if something unseen stood behind him waiting its turn. Joseph noticed something different: the keys. The colonel no longer left them visible on his belt. Margaret didn't need anyone to explain what that meant. He wasn't afraid the two of them would run. He was afraid they would run together. That realization didn't weaken her. It hardened her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just aware of the power structure she lived inside. She was studying its weak points, its hinge pins, its fatal flaws. And she finally understood slavery wasn't just a system of chains. It was a system of beliefs. And the moment belief breaks, the whole system begins to rot, from the inside out. By October, something irreversible had happened in that cabin. Something the colonel never planned for, never accounted for, and never would have permitted if he'd sensed it forming. Margaret and Joseph were no longer playing the roles he assigned them. They were studying him. They were decoding the psychology of the man who believed he owned their futures. When you live under someone's power long enough, you learn their rhythms the way a hunter learns an animal's tracks. You learn their arrogance, their blind spots, their limits, and the most dangerous thing you can ever learn about a tyrant is what they fear. That was the shift. Joseph stopped seeing the colonel as an unbreakable force. Margaret stopped seeing her father as a patriarch, and at the same time, the colonel was starting to sense, without proof, without words, that something inside his carefully controlled experiment was changing shape. He tried to tighten control, but he didn't understand the truth yet. Authority maintained by force must always expand its violence to survive. That is how all systems of domination eventually expose themselves. So the colonel escalated. More questions, fewer supplies, more hunger, more pressure, more attempts to separate them psychologically. He spoke to Margaret as if Joseph were an animal. He spoke to Joseph as if Margaret were a prize mare. But every visit he made built the same outcome. They were no longer divided by race, class, or hierarchy. They were united by him. And unity under oppression is not cooperation. It's ignition. There was one moment that confirmed it. Small, insignificant on the surface, but monumental underneath. The colonel brought bread. Joseph didn't touch it. Margaret didn't either. No words, no agreement, just a shared refusal. That was the moment the experiment was no longer his. That was the moment the cabin stopped being a cage and became a waiting room. Because now there was only one question left, and it wasn't whether Margaret would become pregnant, or whether Joseph would obey, or whether the colonel's legacy could be saved. The question was who leaves this cabin alive, and the answer no longer belonged to the man who built it. It belonged to the two people he believed he owned, and something inside them had already decided. Ownership was over. The first real plan didn't begin with words. It began with timing. Joseph was the one who noticed it first. The colonel always arrived just before dusk, never at full dark, and never at midday, predictable as a clock wound by ego. Margaret contributed the second piece. He always stayed exactly long enough to assert control, never long enough to risk vulnerability. He needed to be feared, but he also needed to feel safe. That was the weakness. A man who believes he's untouchable never imagines he could be watched. So Joseph began marking the trees beyond the window. Small scratches only visible if you knew to look. Margaret began memorizing the sound of each bootstep, the jingle of the keys, the difference between a door opened in anger and a door opened in caution. They were gathering data, not for escape yet, but for accuracy. A failed escape attempt ends in punishment. A perfect one ends in disappearance. Meanwhile, inside the cabin, the poison took on a different meaning. It was no longer a threat. It was a resource. Arsenic didn't just kill, it weakened. It delayed. It made a strong man doubt his body before he doubted his world. But poison alone wasn't a plan. It was leverage. Margaret understood something Joseph didn't. Her father was not just cruel. He was nostalgic. He believed the world used to be better when he was in control. Men like that never imagined the future coming for them. So she let him talk, let him reminisce, let him feel comfortable. Because comfort makes predators slow. The turning point came the night the Colonel slipped. Literally, his vision blurred, his balance faltered, his hand shook as he tried to steady himself on the table. He blamed the whiskey. Margaret and Joseph blamed nothing at all. They just observed. Someone else might have taken that moment and struck, but they weren't ready to win a battle. They were preparing to end a war. They needed three things. First, time, distance, silence. Joseph had already figured out the path through the trees. Margaret had already memorized the supply routes. The only piece missing was the lock, and they both knew. The next time the Colonel dropped those keys, they wouldn't just notice, they would take them. Winter arrived early that year, an uninvited ally. The cold made every visit harder for the Colonel, every mile of horseback travel slower, every breath visible. And with the cold came something even more valuable than discomfort: necessity. Men who control everything never imagined they could someday need anything. But the colder it got, the more the Colonel needed cooperation. He needed the experiment to succeed quickly. He needed proof. He needed results. And he needed Margaret healthy. That meant, for the first time, he brought more than commands. He brought vulnerability, food, firewood, medicines, a heavier coat for Margaret, gloves for Joseph. All presented as charity, when both of them knew the truth. Nothing given by a man like him is a gift. It's a bribe designed to look like mercy. Margaret accepted every item with lowered eyes. Joseph accepted every item with bowed head, but neither of them accepted the premise. Because the longer the Colonel stayed, the more he exposed. He was aging. He was tired. He was losing weight. The poison was working, not enough to kill, but enough to tilt the world under his feet. His pride forced him to hide it. His body refused to obey. And that clash, between image and reality, is where empires always begin to crack. The keys became the center of everything. Not just physical keys, psychological ones. Keys to his schedule, keys to his habits, keys to his fears, keys to the exact second he let his guard down. It happened on the 9th visit of winter. The Colonel entered, shaking snow off his coat. His voice was sharp, his breath showed strain. He dropped the keys on the table. Habit, not thought. But this time, Joseph didn't look at them. Margaret did. Not with desperation. With calculation. She didn't reach, didn't move, didn't betray intention. But in her eyes, in the stillness of her body, Joseph saw it. They were done waiting for freedom to arrive. They were going to take it. That night, after the door locked and the horse hooves faded into the trees, they finally spoke the plan aloud. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was surgical. They would not escape from the Colonel. They would escape by removing him. Not with violence, not with panic, with precision, because once a man like him is gone, the entire system built on his power collapses with him. The plan had no heroism in it. That was the first rule. No dramatic confrontations, no shouting, no knife in the dark. Stories of rebellion always glamorize resistance, but real survival is quieter. It's math, timing, breath control, nerve. Margaret understood that better than Joseph. She had lived her whole life inside the Colonel's calculations. She knew the way he assessed risk, the way he interpreted silence, the way his mind filled in blanks with whatever made him feel safe. And that was the weapon she brought to the table. She knew exactly what her father expected her not to do. Joseph brought something just as valuable. Patience trained by decades of denied freedom. He had learned how to hide his thoughts so deeply that even he forgot them until the moment they were needed. He was not impulsive. He was not emotional. He was not reckless. He was deliberate. They practiced without calling it practice, passing objects back and forth without touching fingers, moving in the cabin without sound, timing how long it took for the fire to die, how long poison took to melt into liquid, how long footsteps echoed after the door closed. And then came the test, not of the plan, but of themselves. One night, the Colonel stayed longer than usual. Too long, his voice was uneven, his hand trembled when he poured whiskey. He spoke to Margaret, like a man trying to hide that he was losing control of his body. He spoke to Joseph like someone who wanted obedience, but feared. Deep down, it might soon be too late to enforce it. He didn't leave until full dark. He forgot the keys on the table. Joseph looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at the keys, and then, without a word, she did nothing. Because that was the test: could they resist the instinct to act too soon? A single mistake was death, not just for them, but for every enslaved person who might have one day heard their story and believed escape was possible. So Joseph slid the keys back exactly where they were, not out of fear, out of discipline, because freedom taken recklessly is just another form of captivity. They would not run at the first open door. They would wait for the door that never closes again. And when it came, it wouldn't be luck, it would be design. The door that never closed again finally revealed itself in January, brought not by opportunity, but by weakness. The poison had done its work, not enough to kill, but enough to erode the one thing the Colonel relied on more than strength, more than fear, more than money: his certainty. He arrived late, later than ever before. His coat was soaked through, his boots half-laced, his voice dull with a desperation he didn't recognize in himself. He didn't bark orders. He didn't lecture. He leaned. On the table, on the wall, on Margaret's shoulder. That was the moment she knew the power was inverted. Not when he grew sick, not when the keys were left behind, but when he needed her to steady him. A man like the Colonel could survive hatred, rebellion, even violence, but dependency, that was death long before the body gave out. Because now she could decide how much of the world he was allowed to feel, how much air he was allowed to breathe, how much truth he was allowed to see. And she gave him nothing. No warmth, no reassurance, no familiarity. She treated him the way he treated every life he owned, like he was temporary. Joseph watched the scene unfold in silence, but there was something new in his gaze, something Margaret hadn't seen until now. Not fear, not rage. Recognition. He was no longer looking at a master. He was looking at a man he could outlive. That night, after the Colonel collapsed into uneasy sleep in the chair by the fire, they did something they had never done before. They planned aloud in front of him. Softly, calmly, with the clarity of people who no longer believed in his authority, because he could hear them, and it no longer mattered. The choice was no longer whether to poison him further, or strike him dead, or flee into the woods. The choice was how loud the world would hear about what happened here. A single death could bury the story. A disappearance could erase it, but a legacy, the kind that proves a system can be broken from inside, that required more than survival. It required witnesses, so the plan shifted, not just escape, exposure. Because if one cabin could fall, others could follow. And revolutions don't start with fire. They start when someone realizes the cage was never locked, only believed to be. The next morning, the Colonel woke to a world that no longer obeyed him. Not because he was tied down, not because he was threatened, but because no one in the room asked what he wanted. Power doesn't disappear when a man is overthrown. It disappears when people stop behaving as if he still has it. Margaret served breakfast without waiting for his approval. Joseph stoked the fire without being told. The rhythm of the cabin was no longer set by the Colonel's voice. It moved around him, not through him, and he felt it. That was the real poison, not arsenic. Irrelevance. He tried to reassert control, cleared his throat, straightened his coat, attempted the familiar tone of command. But every sentence came out thinner than the last. His authority had always depended on belief, and now even he didn't believe it. When he reached for the keys on his belt, the reflex of a man reminding the world who owned the locks, his hand landed on nothing but leather. They were gone, not stolen, transferred. Margaret wore them, not hidden, not secret, visible at her waist, where he used to keep them, like an unspoken verdict. The colonel stared at them, then at her. He didn't rage. Rage is for men who still think they can win. No, what filled his eyes was older, heavier, the realization that history had finally slipped out of his hands. Joseph stood beside her, not behind, not beneath, beside, and that symmetry was the thing the colonel couldn't look at for long. Because it wasn't rebellion. It was equality, and equality is the one thing a man built on domination can never survive. They could have ended it there. They could have walked out, left him to die or live or rot. But they understood something larger than revenge. If he vanished, the story vanished with him. If he died quietly, the lie lived on. They didn't want justice for themselves alone. They wanted proof. They wanted the world to see what he had tried to build. What men like him still believed. They could resurrect in the shadows. And to know that it failed. So they didn't run. They made arrangements. They wrote letters. They waited for the right witness. Because escape would free 2 people, and exposure could free hundreds. And for the first time in her life, Margaret wasn't her father's daughter. She was history's. The next morning, the colonel woke to a world that no longer obeyed him. Not because he was tied down. Not because he was threatened, but because no one in the room asked what he wanted. Power doesn't disappear when a man is overthrown. It disappears when people stop behaving as if he still has it. Margaret served breakfast without waiting for his approval. Joseph stoked the fire without being told. The rhythm of the cabin was no longer set by the colonel's voice. It moved around him, not through him, and he felt it. That was the real poison. Not arsenic, irrelevance. He tried to reassert control, cleared his throat, straightened his coat, attempted the familiar tone of command. But every sentence came out thinner than the last. His authority had always depended on belief, and now even he didn't believe it. When he reached for the keys on his belt, the reflex of a man reminding the world who owned the locks. His hand landed on nothing but leather. They were gone, not stolen, transferred. Margaret wore them, not hidden, not secret, visible at her waist, where he used to keep them, like an unspoken verdict. The colonel stared at them, then at her. He didn't rage. Rage is for men who still think they can win. No, what filled his eyes was older, heavier, the realization that history had finally slipped out of his hands. Joseph stood beside her, not behind, not beneath, beside, and that symmetry was the thing the colonel couldn't look at for long. Because it wasn't rebellion. It was equality, and equality is the one thing a man built on domination can never survive. They could have ended it there. They could have walked out, left him to die or live or rot. But they understood something larger than revenge. If he vanished, the story vanished with him. If he died quietly, the lie lived on. They didn't want justice for themselves alone. They wanted proof. They wanted the world to see what he had tried to build. What men like him still believed they could resurrect in the shadows. And to know that it failed, so they didn't run. They made arrangements. They wrote letters. They waited for the right witness. Because escape would free 2 people, exposure could free hundreds. And for the first time in her life, Margaret wasn't her father's daughter. She was history's. The letters were the most dangerous part of the plan. Because letters lived longer than people, Margaret wrote the first one herself. Slowly, carefully, every stroke of the ink a quiet rebellion. She didn't write like a victim. She wrote like a witness. Not just to what her father had done, but to how he had done it. The secrecy, the breeding ideology, the experiment, the cabin, the forced pairing. She named names, dates, locations. She wrote it the way courts write testimony, not to convince, to document. Joseph wrote the second letter, not to a court but to a man he trusted, a preacher who had buried enough bodies to know what silence cost. He didn't ask for rescue. He asked for truth to travel. Truth, he said, was faster on foot than any horse owned by a white man. Both letters ended the same way. We are not missing. We are not dead. We were taken, and we did not stay. So once the ink dried, there was no turning back. The only thing left was timing. Margaret knew the Colonel's brother would come eventually. Blood always comes when inheritance is at stake. And a sick man alone in the woods, that was a summons no family ignored. So they waited. The Colonel didn't speak much anymore. He watched them like a man staring at the ruins of his own architecture. He didn't beg. He didn't apologize. He observed, and that was the final proof. He knew his legacy was gone, not because he might die, but because he would be remembered accurately. Control was never about life or death. It was about narrative, and now the narrative belonged to the people he believed couldn't write it. The snow thawed. The road softened, and one morning, before the sun was fully up, they heard it. The distant crunch of a wagon on frozen dirt. Not soldiers, not rescue, a witness. Margaret didn't look afraid. Joseph didn't look angry. They looked ready. They weren't planning to run into the woods. They were planning to walk out the front door, together, and leave the Colonel behind, not as a body but as evidence, because some men deserve death, but some systems deserve exposure, and exposure, once released, doesn't need chains. It spreads. The wagon stopped outside the cabin, its wheels cracking the frost like bones under weight. Margaret didn't rush to the door. Joseph didn't reach for a weapon. They had already won the only battle that mattered. The quiet one, the one inside the mind of the man who once ruled their lives like a god. The knock was sharp but cautious, someone unsure of what they were walking into. Margaret opened the door with the keys still at her waist, not hidden, not flaunted, simply owned. A man stood outside, wrapped in travel dust and questions. The Colonel's brother. Same jaw, same arrogance. Except his authority had not yet been dismantled. He looked past Margaret, expecting to see his brother towering, commanding, in control. He saw a man slumped in a chair instead, alive, but hollowed out by something no doctor could cure: the slow collapse of belief. "Is he ill?" the brother asked. "No," Margaret said. "He is finished." It wasn't an insult. It was a report. Joseph stepped into view, not as property, not as caution, but as presence. And in that moment, the brother saw the truth, not just about the Colonel, but about the world he thought was still intact. Power had shifted, not in a riot, not in a rebellion. In a room, in silence, the brother tried to reassert the old language: authority, inheritance, explanation. But the story had already been sealed. Margaret handed him the letter addressed in her own hand. "Read it before you speak," she said. "Because once you speak, you're part of it." He didn't open it immediately. Men like him never imagine letters can be weapons. But the weight of the sealed page unsettled him. He could feel the danger of it. Not violence, record. The Colonel finally spoke, voice paper, thin. "She's lying." But it wasn't a denial. It was a confession, because a man who still believes he owns the truth never needs to say it. Margaret didn't argue. Joseph didn't correct him. They didn't need to. They stepped outside, not running, not hiding, but walking with the calm of people leaving a grave they didn't dig. The brother watched him go, holding the letter like something warm enough to burn. Inside the cabin sat the Colonel, surrounded by everything he had built, and none of the power he built it for. Some endings roar. This one witnessed itself. They didn't look back. That was the truest sign of freedom. No dramatic turn toward the past, no lingering over the ruins. Margaret and Joseph walked down the narrow path, through the thawing woods, each step measured, unhurried, as if they had been walking this way all their lives, and had only just remembered where it led. Behind them, the cabin stood like an artifact of a sickness finally contained. By the time the first sound of spring reached them, the trickle of melting ice, the startled cry of a crow, they were miles from the estate. The air tasted different. Not clean, exactly, but possible. Every mile was a negotiation between fear and faith. Fear that someone would come after them. Faith that no one could anymore. They didn't speak for hours. Words had been the language of their captivity. Silence was the language of their survival. But silence, too, can be communion. When they finally rested near a riverbank, Margaret broke it softly. "What do we do with the rest of it?" Joseph looked at her, understanding without explanation. "We live it out," he said. That's the only thing they never counted on. Living was the rebellion. Somewhere behind them, the colonel's brother would open the letter. He would read about the experiment, the breeding, the confinement, the poison, and he would face the same choice every man in power eventually faces: bury the truth, or let it become uncontrollable. And men like him, Margaret knew, always underestimate what paper can do. Because paper spreads faster than people, and ink, unlike blood, doesn't dry quietly. Weeks passed. They kept to the woods, following trading routes and whispers, bartering labor for food, never giving names. But every night, when the fire died low, Joseph would look into the embers, as if listening for footsteps that never came. And every morning, Margaret woke before dawn, the keys still at her waist. Not for doors anymore, but as proof that the past could be unlocked. Freedom didn't look like triumph. It looked like exhaustion that didn't end in terror. It looked like choice. And sometimes, when they crossed another border and saw the horizon widen, Margaret would say under her breath, not as prayer, not as defiance, but as record Z. He isn't the end of the story. He's just the last page of the lie. News travels strangely in a country built on silence. Sometimes it gallops on horseback. Sometimes it hides in hymns. Sometimes it sits in the corner of a tavern, until a man with the right guilt in his eyes hears it and carries it farther. The story of the colonel's cabin did not explode. It leaked, first as rumor, then as accusation, then as something harder to bury pattern. The letter wasn't just read, it was copied. By the preacher, by abolitionists, by a printer in Philadelphia who saw in it not just outrage, but evidence. And with every retelling, the colonel's name became less that of a respected landowner, and more that of a man who tried to breed human beings like livestock, and failed. He was no longer an individual. He was a symbol. Symbols cannot defend themselves. Meanwhile, Margaret and Joseph kept moving, not as fugitives now, but as untraceable witnesses. They crossed into a place where the law no longer recognized ownership of people, but where danger still wore new uniforms and new smiles. Freedom was not a destination. It was a daily decision not to return to the shape the past wanted them to fit. Joseph began working with carpenters. His hands, once forced into labor, now shaped wood by choice. There was peace in that, building something that didn't belong to someone else. Margaret found work as a midwife's assistant. She held newborns and thought about the child she never had, the child she was supposed to produce for her father's legacy. Sometimes the grief came like a faint bruise. Sometimes it came like relief. They never spoke his name again. They didn't need to. The world was speaking it now, and not the way he'd imagined. Months later, in a quiet town where no one knew who they had been, Joseph asked a question that sounded like something larger than the two of them. "Do you think it matters, what we did?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. She looked at the road, the sky, the hands she finally recognized as her own. "It matters," she said, "because he thought the story would end with him, but we walked out of it. That means the story belongs to us now." And then, almost like a vow, every time someone tells what he did, we live a little further from it. Freedom wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the telling. But the colonel was not a man who surrendered his version of reality. When the first printed copy of Margaret's letter reached Richmond, he did not panic. He planned. Men like him did not believe in being exposed. They believed in reclaiming the narrative. He went to the courthouse, to the sheriff, to judges whose tobacco fields had once been fertilized by the same enslaved hands. And with a calmness that bordered on madness, he declared the letter a forgery. He said Margaret had been abducted by northern agitators. He said Joseph had died of disease, not violence. He swore that he was the victim, and the world, at least the world that still needed to believe in the old order, wanted to believe him. But something had shifted. The rumor no longer served him. It fed others. Editors smelled blood. Abolitionist societies smelled opportunity. And Southern planters smelled the one thing they feared more than financial loss: moral exposure. Because if one colonel could be accused of breeding his own daughter like livestock, how many quiet, unspoken versions of that story existed in plantations from Georgia to Louisiana? The North didn't see a grieving father. They saw a case study. The South didn't see a slandered gentleman. They saw a crack in the wall. For the first time, the colonel felt it, the weight of being observed. He hired men to travel north, to find Margaret, to retrieve any letters still circulating. Not because he cared about her, because he cared about his name. In the antebellum world, legacy was currency. Reputation was inheritance. A scandal like this could bankrupt a bloodline more efficiently than war. But what he never understood, what men like him never understand, was that the world had changed the moment the truth escaped his control. The letter was not dangerous because of the paper it was written on. It was dangerous because it gave shape to something millions already sensed, but could not speak. That slavery did not just break bodies. It corrupted the minds that justified it. The colonel believed he was fighting to restore order, but history would record something else entirely. He was fighting a war that had already ended. Because once a story leaves the mouth of the oppressed, no amount of power can force it back into silence. Winter came early that year. Richmond's streets froze under a crust of ice that cracked beneath carriage wheels like breaking bones. The colonel stopped walking his property at night. He no longer trusted the shadows. Servants whispered that they'd seen him pacing his study, candlelight trembling against the walls, muttering names that weren't there. Margaret, Joseph, Liberia, arsenic. He had begun to confuse memory with judgment. Every sound became an accusation, every silence a verdict. But it wasn't guilt, at least not the kind that leads to repentance. It was possession. The colonel was haunted, not by what he'd done, but by the fact that someone had found out. His sin wasn't cruelty. It was exposure. That's how power thinks, not in terms of morality, but of control. To lose the illusion of control is the greatest humiliation for those who built their lives on domination. His lawyer urged him to retire quietly, to leave Virginia, start over in Texas where men like him were still gods. But he refused. He couldn't abandon the land. It was his mirror, his creation. Even as it decayed, he mistook its ruin for his dignity. He held lavish dinners with empty seats, to prove he was still a man of standing. He invited guests who never came. He drank brandy from crystal glasses engraved with the family crest, then smashed them one by one when no one toasted back. The house itself began to rot in rhythm with him. Mold spread through the walls. The portraits of his ancestors warped under moisture, their eyes bubbling like the faces in fever dreams. The slaves remaining on the property kept their distance. They said the colonel spoke to the walls, and the walls sometimes answered. And then, something changed in the air. A whine through the chimneys that sounded almost human. The staff would later swear that on certain nights, a woman's voice sang from the edge of the woods. Others said it wasn't singing. It was warning. But the colonel didn't hear music. He heard evidence. He fired 2 men for whispering about ghosts. The next morning, one of them was found dead in the river, his mouth filled with soil. The official cause, accidental drowning. But those who knew the colonel understood. When a man builds his world on lies, The truth doesn't need to haunt him. It simply waits for the walls to collapse. By early spring, the colonel was no longer feared, only watched. The world that once bowed before his name now treated him like a man already half buried. His neighbors stopped calling. His invitations returned unopened. Even the politicians he had once funded avoided eye contact when they passed him in town, as if scandal were contagious. Power doesn't vanish, it recoils, leaving its former owner exposed like a statue with the marble stripped away. But the true collapse didn't begin with a headline or a courtroom loss. It began with a question. A young reporter from Boston, a nobody, barely 22, arrived in Richmond with a satchel of newspapers, an ink-stained coat, and one intention to verify the letter. He wasn't there to destroy the colonel. He was there to confirm whether the story was real, and that was the most dangerous kind of man. The seeker, not the accuser. The colonel refused to meet him, so the reporter spoke to the enslaved workers instead, and then to the midwife who remembered Margaret's childhood illnesses, and then to the sheriff who signed Joseph's death certificate. Piece by piece, a narrative the colonel once controlled began stitching itself together without him. Truth does that. It doesn't need permission, it only needs one open mouth. The Boston paper ran the story in serialized form, one column at a time, every Sunday. Not as a scandal, but as a case study in the rot at the heart of the Southern aristocracy. The colonel became a symbol again, but this time, not of power, nor cruelty, but decline. His name was no longer attached to prestige. It was attached to a thesis that slavery required not just force, but delusion. That's when the letters began arriving, not to the colonel, to Margaret, dozens of them. Then hundreds. Women writing in secret, confessing lives trapped inside gilded cages. Men admitting the things they'd seen but never said, former slaves describing arrangements on plantations too similar to hers to be coincidence. Everyone had a version of the story, but no one had spoken until someone else did first. Margaret read each letter in silence. Then she did something her father never predicted. She sent them back. Not with answers, but with copies of her original confession. Truth multiplied. Rebellion didn't march. It whispered. Through ink, through testimony, through the sudden, shattering realization that silence was not safety. It was complicity, and the world was done being complicit. The colonel's enemies were no longer men with rifles or lawyers with papers. They were voices, and voices are impossible to shoot. Every letter Margaret sent back became a fuse. In a powder trail stretching far beyond Virginia, her story wasn't just believed now. It was being mirrored. People weren't reacting to the Hartley scandal. They were recognizing it. And the colonel finally understood the most terrifying truth of all. He wasn't being exposed for being unique. He was being exposed for being ordinary. That was the death blow. Plantation culture survived on illusion of honor, hierarchy, noble bloodlines. But once people realized the abuse wasn't a dark exception, it was the system itself. The myth cracked. And myths, once cracked, don't heal. So the colonel did what cornered men of power always do. He escalated. He sued newspapers. He threatened politicians. He wrote public rebuttals so long and manic they read like confessions written in reverse. He demanded the governor charge Margaret with treason. But here was the shift. The world no longer cared what he declared. It cared what she had survived. Even in the South, a quiet repositioning had begun. Not moral, not empathetic, strategic. Men who once admired him now feared association. His name was poison. His scandals became infectious. To defend him was to confess alignment with the same sickness. And the colonel, who once controlled 400 acres and 67 human lives, now controlled nothing but his own unraveling. The last allies he had left were the kind money buys, and money doesn't stay loyal when the ground starts burning. He was still dangerous, yes, still armed with influence, rage, and the illusion of authority. But power is not measured by what a man shouts, it's measured by who still listens. and no one was listening anymore. The only person who refused to speak at all was Margaret. She never defended herself. She never debated the facts. She never entered the newspapers. She understood something her father never would. When a truth is big enough, you don't argue it. You let the world trip over it again and again until it can't pretend not to see it. The colonel wanted obedience. Margaret had given the world something far more dangerous than rebellion. She gave it evidence, and once evidence multiplies, it becomes history. The colonel's downfall did not arrive with a dramatic arrest or a public trial. It arrived in fragments, small, silent erasures of power. First, the bank revoked his line of credit. Then the railroad company withdrew from the land deal he'd been counting on. The invitations to political dinners stopped. The sheriff, once a loyal hunting partner, suddenly became unavailable. No one confronted him. No one warned him. They simply stepped back and let gravity do the rest. It is a strange kind of death when a man is not destroyed, but abandoned. He started locking doors that no one wanted to enter. He wrote letters to congressmen who no longer replied. He walked through the halls of his house as if it were a battlefield. Each silence a corpse, each memory a ghost. Even the servants stopped speaking above a whisper. Not out of respect, out of anticipation. Something was coming, and everyone sensed it but him. Meanwhile, Margaret, whose mere existence now threatened the legacy of an entire class, refused to disappear. She began documenting everything: dates, names, transactions, births, sales, punishments. Not as memoir, but as ledger. The kind that could not be dismissed as emotion or rumor. She wasn't writing a story. She was writing a record, and records survive the men who fear them. When abolitionist groups requested copies, she sent them without hesitation. When newspapers asked for interviews, she declined. She was no longer a witness. She was an archivist of a system built on sanctioned cruelty. Every detail she preserved was a crack in the facade of plantation nobility. And then, inevitably, one of those records reached someone the colonel could not intimidate: a congressional investigator. Not a journalist, not an activist. A man with the authority to subpoena. And for the first time, the colonel realized his greatest fear wasn't exposure, it was verification. Because lies can be denied. But ledgers testify. The investigator arrived in Richmond not as a threat, but as a formality. The kind of formality governments use when they've already decided a man's guilt and only need the paperwork to match. The colonel still believed he could outtalk, outspend, or out-intimidate any opponent. But he was no longer in a world where voices mattered. He was in a world where numbers did. And the numbers, the names, the ages, the prices, the punishments, were no longer locked in his desk. They were in Margaret's hands. And soon, they would belong to the nation.